I love building vintage kits. There's just something about them, and this time round I'm going to be building this kit which appears to come straight out of the 1970s. Hello everyone, I'm Matt, this is Model Minutes, and join me on the workbench today as I build a Frog DHC Venom in 1/72 scale. So this kit appears to be pretty much near mint. I say near mint because it appears that it may have been opened once upon a time, a little correction slip telling you to add decals before adding the underwing stores was added, and then it was carefully resealed. Other than that, it seems to be pretty much in its 1970s shop-bought condition. So I'll pop a list of the products I used during this build on the screen here to give you an idea of the kind of things to go and get if you fancy replicating a similar project. But without any further ado, I think it's time to actually start building this one. As usual, my first steps will be to cut the parts away from the sprue using my cutters and shaving away any flash with a sharp knife or sanding down the plastic where needed. Tamiya extra thin cement will be my glue of choice. And the first step is to build up the cockpit interior. There's not a great deal of detail in here. There are a couple of seats for the pilot and I presume navigator to sit in, and these were added onto the cockpit floor. This assembly is glued into the slots in one of the fuselage halves, and because this kit comes with a display stand included, I cut out the slot on the bottom of the aircraft. The display stand comes in two parts, and it was a simple process to join them together. And now I'm ready to do a little painting. Some of this Army Painter matte black was just painted onto the bare plastic inside of the cockpit area. Vallejo Camouflage Olive Green would be used for the overalls of the pilots, which are included. You can see that I've already painted their boots black. Vallejo Khaki would be used to pick out what I presume is a life vest, or at the very least some strapping, as well as their gloves. And then Humbrol 61, which is a matte flesh colour, was used on the visible parts of their faces. Humbrol 25, which is a matte blue, was painted onto their helmets. I thought it would be fun to do a more vibrant colour to help them stand out a little bit inside the cockpit. 32, which is a dark grey, was painted onto the face mask and oxygen tube, as well as the visor on the helmet. Some of this Army Painter strong tone wash was painted onto the figures as well, just to help bring out some of the details and add a little bit of contrast. These are not the best figures in the world, but they'll do for adding a bit of visual interest to the cockpit area. So with the cockpit and the figures painted, they could then be added in. And at this point I joined the fuselage halves together. It probably is worth mentioning that because I'm displaying this in a flying pose, I've not added any nose weight. But it would be worth adding nose weight if you were doing this with the wheels lowered. And it's probably in this component, which is the nose of the aircraft, which would be the perfect place for it. But I simply just glued this on. There is a bit of a seam down the centre line of the fuselage, so I spent a little bit of time just trying to clean it up with my sanding stick. An engine exhaust needs to be glued in at the back of the fuselage. And then I turned my attention to the wings. The wings come in two halves, with the lowers being joined onto the upper surfaces, and then these can be inserted into their slots on the side of the fuselage. The fit here isn't quite perfect, and there is a small gap, which may need a little bit of filler later on. This aircraft comes with its tail booms in two halves as well, and these could be glued together and then inserted into their holes on the back of the wing. Again, the fit here is not perfect, and I will have to address this with a little filler a little bit later in the build. I did make sure to add the horizontal tail surface in between the two booms before they were glued solid. Flipping the aircraft over, I installed the landing gear components in their raised positions. Of course, as mentioned, you could add them in the lowered position if you wanted to, but this project is going to be displayed in flight. There are some smaller details such as this air intake which needs to be glued on, and also the arrestor hook, which gets attached into its holes at the rear of the aircraft. As I mentioned earlier, I do have to pay a bit of attention to a few little gaps and things, so this Amomig putty surfacer in medium consistency was painted into those relevant areas. I quite like using this product because it is quite a thin filler liquid and you can build up the layers in the correct places. When it's dry, it can be sanded nice and smooth. This did take a little bit of work to try and get it looking as neat as possible, but I think eagle-eyed viewers might be able to spot a few areas where it doesn't look quite perfect, but it is a old and slightly clunky tooling, so it's bound to have a few problems in places. Humbrol Clear Fix is a clear glue which I'll use to attach the cockpit canopy. I've already masked the cockpit canopy using the very subtle framework as a guide for my masking tape. I've done this using my normal method, which is to apply tape and then cut it to the correct shape. I don't think the moulded framework is particularly accurate, as some of the windows, particularly the front windscreen, looks to be awfully small, but I went with it anyway. The Clear Fix should glue this onto the model without reacting with the plastic and causing it to fog up, which other cements can cause. And now it's time to prime. I do quite enjoy using this Army Painter black primer from a rattle can. It gives a nice uniform finish which I can spray over the top with my airbrush ready paints in a little bit. I will leave the display stand in this black primer colour. Unfortunately, I ran out of this paint halfway through priming the aircraft. So having only primed the top surface, I had to use this generic grey primer on the lower surfaces. This grey primer does work quite well too, despite being a cheap product you can find in most home hardware shops here in the UK. The first paint I'm going to use is this Outlaw RAF White. This is a lacquer paint which was loaded straight into my airbrush as it's airbrush ready. I attempted to do some simple shading to try and bring out a little bit of modulation in the next layers of paintwork. To be honest though, I don't know how successful this was because I probably go a bit heavier with the paints in the next steps. This SMS Surfacer Black is technically another primer, but I thought it would be suitable for spraying onto the nose of the aircraft. According to the painting instructions on the back of the cardboard header, this aircraft had a black nose, so I sprayed it in this colour and then would mask it. For the lower surface of the aircraft, I'm going to use this Hataka Sky Type S, thinned down with a little bit of their lacquer thinner. As I mentioned earlier, I have already pre-shaded the aircraft, and this light sky colour should show some of it through, but I am a little bit heavy-handed with my airbrushing, and the bit of advice I'm always given is stop before you think you need to stop, and sometimes I just don't. So I don't think much of this will be visible, but at the very least, a nice smooth and uniform paint finish is perfectly acceptable to me. With that lower surface now complete and dry, it would be masked, and then this extra dark sea grey, which is another Hataka lacquer, would be thinned a little bit and also applied to the model. Once again, I probably ended up with more of a uniform finish than one which was a little bit more modulated. After this, I would mask some of the upper surfaces and use this Vallejo Model Air French Blue on the wingtip tanks. The paint scheme that I've chosen to do has these in a much more vibrant colour, which I thought this would be a nice suitable shade for. With that dry, Outlaw Yellow was sprayed onto the tip and the very rear of these wingtip tanks, having masked the centres which are currently blue. So I'll leave that aircraft to one side for now and make sure it's completely dry. But in the meantime, I'm going to use this Vallejo Camouflage Olive Green on the rockets which I've not yet attached to the aircraft. This olive brown colour was used to pick out the explosive warheads. and some gunmetal would be carefully applied to the brackets which hold the rockets together and support them under the aircraft. Whilst I've got this gunmetal paint out, it's probably a good idea to paint this onto the air intakes as well, and also the engine exhaust at the rear of the aircraft. Before I apply the decals, I'm going to give the aircraft a coat of this custom service satin varnish. This is acrylic and airbrush ready. You technically don't need to have a satin or a gloss varnish applied to your model before putting decals on, but because the decals are quite old, I would like to give them the best chance of applying to the model without leaving any silvering, so a nice smooth paint finish should achieve that. And speaking of the decals, these are actually the original ones. They seem to have held up reasonably well and don't have anything in the way of cracking in the decal film that I can see. However, I do worry that the decal film is not as central and some of the printing is actually not on the decal film. For the moment though, I'll cut the sheet into more manageable sections, ready for application. So the decals would be dipped into some warm water to help release them from the backing paper. A little extra time might be needed due to their age, and I did notice that the paper backing did want to fold up a little bit. Don't forget that you can get your own brushwater mug from my merch store, and hopefully that should help you never get confused between your brushwater and your mug of tea. I'm going to use some VMS Decal Set and Fix and Decal Softener as my setting solutions during this project, once again just to try and help ensure that the decals will settle onto the plastic kit. First up, the Set and Fix would be applied in the areas where the decals are going to go. The decals were carefully slid into position, and the Set and Fix should help soften them into the surface and almost bond them onto the model. I did find that when applying these warning stripes on the rear of the aircraft that they were a little bit flaky and did want to fall apart slightly. The bits which are coming away are primarily the ones which are not on the decal film, because the decal film seems to be out of register. So to prevent any further headaches, I went over the top of all the decals using some of this microscale liquid decal film. This was painted onto the transfers which have not yet been soaked in warm water, and should add a protective layer which is still flexible, and help prevent them from disintegrating as I apply them to the model. With that done, I would repeat my process of dipping them in warm water, a little bit of the decal setting solution applied, and then sliding them into place. This worked much better, and there wasn't any risk of them falling apart at this point thanks to that liquid decal film helping to add an extra bond to the decal. So from this point onwards, the decal application was actually relatively straightforward. The decals are printed to a moderate quality given their age, and they haven't suffered much in the way with yellowing. The only thing I had to make sure with this particular kit was to get the roundels facing the right way. The kangaroo, as I've learnt from a previous project, should be facing towards the front of the aircraft. With the decals in place, some of this decal softener was then painted over the top. This should add a further layer of softening to help them really blend into the surface and almost appear as though they were painted on. With the decals cured, some XW1 Ultra Matte Varnish from K-Colors was loaded into the airbrush and sprayed over the entire aircraft. This is going to dull down that slightly glossy finish from earlier and protect the transfers. Unfortunately, after a few coats of this varnish, I have discovered that the decal setting solution has left a bit of a strange residue around the transfers. I'm not entirely happy with this, but I think I can fix it. Some of this Outlaw Satin Clear, which is a lacquer-based paint, was sprayed over these offending areas. My thought process here is that a more glossy finish should help smooth it out and almost hide that residue. With that done, I would go back over the top with the Ultra Matte to try and blend everything back together again. And actually, yeah, that seems to have fixed the problem. That residue has now disappeared, which is quite good. Flipping over to the other side of the aircraft, I still need to install those rockets, which I hadn't until now because I was worried that I may have to work around some transfers. And with those rockets attached, I carefully peeled away my homemade canopy masks, which appear to have done a pretty good job of keeping the clear panels free from paint. The final step in this build was to slot the display stand on the bottom, and with that I'm going to call this build complete. And that's another build under the belt. So what do I think of this one? Well, despite the age of this kit, I actually quite enjoyed it. I've never built a sea Venom before, although I have done a sea vampire and other vampires. The Venom does make a slightly different subject on my display shelf. Firstly, I'll talk about a few of the things that I didn't really like about this kit and then swing into some of the more positives. So first up, given its age, it's quite understandable that this is a rather simple kit. It does lack in a lot of detail, particularly in the cockpit area. There's nothing more than a few seats and the crew. The details are generally overall quite crude, and it features raised panel lines. There was some flash I had to deal with, and some sink and pin marks are present in places, but for the most part not many of them are going to be particularly visible on the finished kit. I think one of the main problems was some of the fit issues around the wings and those tail booms, which needed quite a bit of filler to get it to look right. The cockpit canopy as well is probably a bit too chunky. The front windscreen panels are not really the right size, they look awfully small, and the frames are far too big. I have heard that there is an aftermarket canopy you can get for this, which may be a little bit more scale accurate. The decals I was generally happy with. I found the printing to be quite good, although the registration in a few places is slightly off. You can see like the white first layer just peeking out from some of the roundels and some of those hatched areas on the top of the wing. I'm glad I tried them out first to see if they would work, and upon discovering that they were a bit flaky and wanted to disintegrate, the microscale liquid decal film has solved that problem. Also, the residue left over from the setting solution could have been a problem, but with my application of satin and then matte varnish again, seems to have fixed it. Perhaps one of the problems that I caused myself a little bit is the fact that my pre-shading wasn't really good enough, and then my final paint colours on top means that you can't really tell that I even did any pre-shading, so this now has more of a uniform paint finish rather than something that brings out some of the details. But that's not necessarily a bad thing depending on the aesthetic that you were looking for. Things I do like about this kit are that it comes with 2 different paint schemes included, and the painting instructions are in full colour. I also like that it is quite simple. It meant that it didn't take me too long to complete this project, and I do actually keep a note of everything that I do in my modeller's journal, which is like a diary which I've created specifically to help me on the workbench, and if you want one for your own workbench to keep a track of your own builds, you can find them linked below the video. But in here I have said this one took me about a week to complete, but I was working it in and around other commitments and other projects. I'm pretty sure this is one of the first releases from 1973, back when this was tooled. I say this because it comes with the cardboard header and the bag. I think from 1974 onwards it actually came inside of a cardboard box, and then after that point it entered the Nova range and has been released in different companies ever since. So this tooling has been around, and I think it has been around from other companies even in more recent years, but some of the more slightly obscure brands that are out there. I think that I paid around £5 for this a few years ago, which means that it is quite good value for me. I got a couple of days of real enjoyment out of this project, and it totally justifies that cost. Of course, if you found one of these on the second-hand market, you probably would want to consider what value this particular model has for you, given some of the problems it has. And sometimes that's the things with model kits like this, isn't it? That although it might have problems, sometimes the enjoyment you have actually outweighs the issues that you had. So yeah, despite the fact that this kit has a few issues, I actually really enjoyed it, and might even consider building it again in the future if I could find another one, which I'm not sure would be completely possible. But you know, never say never. So yeah, I think it's probably time to wrap this one up here. Whilst this is a bit of an old and clunky kit, I did, for the most part, enjoy completing the Frog 1970s vintage de Havilland Sea Venom in 1/72nd scale. In particular, this one done in the Royal Australian Navy paint scheme. But let me know, what do you think of this particular project? What do you think of my build? And do you agree that my assessment of it was fair? As always, don't forget that we do have a Model Minutes Model Club, and if you'd like to join the Model Minutes Model Club and get exclusive access to early videos and other perks just like these people on screen, check out the links below the video. Massive thanks to these Model Club members for helping me to create consistent content. There are other ways to help support the channel if you'd prefer, but the best way to support the channel for free is by subscribing with notifications turned on so you never miss a modelling upload. Finally though, last thing to say is a massive thank you to you for watching this one, and I'll catch you on the workbench again next time.